The next meeting thing. That's okay, I can watch. Yeah. It's unfortunate, but yes.
Looks like most don't have their cameras on anyway.
Yeah. Must be a relative.
Well, if do you need those 10 tabs open or whatever you have?
I want to read about
Hi,
that.
everybody.
text.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Come along in, and we'll be getting started here in 1 or 2 minutes.
You need me to get you an napkin?
Got one on the floor apparently.
Sticky.
Neat.
Alrighty, I think I will get started. It seems like we've got a good core group to get started. So welcome, folks. Thanks for attending. Thanks for spending your evening with me here tonight for a little bit to talk about one of my favorite topics in the world, which is, of course, as you know, keystone species. Let me share my screen here really quick for everybody. And can everyone see that okay?
No. Yes.
There we go. All right. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Okay. So tonight we're going to be talking about one of the driving forces behind the Southern Plains Land Trust sort of mission. And this is something that I'm super proud to be a part of, this sort of focus on restoring these keystone species to the Southern Plains and the shortgrass prairie. We're also going to talk about ecosystem processes such as fire today. So welcome, and let's get right into it. So a little bit of background for those who aren't super familiar with the Great Plains, although if you know me, you probably have heard me talk about this before, but the Great Plains is an absolutely enormous ecosystem. So more than 700 million acres, more than 1 million square miles. It encompasses about a third of the United States continental landmass. So it's just a huge ecosystem. And it has historically, throughout most of time up until the 1800s, was inhabited by a broad diversity of different indigenous tribes who managed this ecosystem. They lived there, they interacted with animals. And here's just a snapshot of that around the year 1820. And this ecosystem was once the Serengeti of America. So you probably have heard that term before if you've spent any time around Split, but it was absolutely teeming with wildlife. We're talking about species that are now thought to be species that are usually montane species like grizzly bear and wolves, apex predators that used to be in enormous abundance on the plains. In fact, there were as many as an estimated 50,000 grizzly bears on the plains and more than 500,000 wolves in this ecosystem. So just an incredible ecosystem teeming with life, and it was that way for millennia beforehand. And if you look at the sort of distribution of the different types of prairie, there are three main types. There's short grass, which is the farthest west, mixed grass in the middle, and then tall grass in the east. And those different types of prairie are dictated by precipitation. So these prairies, particularly as you move farther to the west, it gets drier and more arid, and you tend to get shorter grass, which is why you move from tall to mixed to short grass prairie. These prairies are dryland systems. They're driven by precipitation and rainfall and by dynamics of drought. And so when you look out at a prairie the next time, I want you to think of it as the tip of the iceberg. You're looking out at just a little bit of mostly what is underground. Again, these incredibly dense and well-developed root systems are specifically adapted to be able to capture as much water whenever it rains in these dry systems that don't rain very often. And the Great Plains is an incredibly important ecosystem for a variety of reasons. One of the main ones, and one that people often overlook when it comes to grasslands, is the importance of carbon storage. So grasslands actually store approximately a third of the world's terrestrial carbon. You often think of forests as carbon sinks, but grasslands do their fair share. Water filtration and purification. A healthy grassland is a natural sort of sponge that filters out all the bad stuff. Nutrient cycling, wildlife habitat, which is what we're going to be focusing on a lot today, some of the wildlife that inhabits these systems, but just an incredibly important ecosystem. Righty. Just looking in the chat here. Okay. So again, this ecosystem was dominated by some really important species. We're going to talk about what a keystone species means here in a minute. We'll define that. But to introduce you to what the plains used to look like across this region, there were a lot of this species, the American bison. In fact, between 30 to 60 million were estimated to be inhabiting the plains at the peak of their abundance prior to westward expansion. Black-tailed prairie dogs, which is one of our favorite split species, an ecosystem engineer, another keystone species that we'll talk about a lot here. It was estimated that there were as many as 5 billion black-tailed prairie dogs. I repeat, 5 billion prairie dogs, okay? There was a colony in northern Texas that was 200 miles long and 100 miles wide and contained an estimated 500 million prairie dogs in a single colony. So we're talking
Henry,
about just enormous
Henry,
abundance of
I'm so
black-tailed
sorry.
prairie dogs.
I'm so sorry to pause you, but there's a lot of chatter going on in the comments because people aren't muted and there's background noise. And I just want everyone to be able to focus on everything that you're saying because it's so important. So I just wanted to make an announcement to the group to please mute yourself. Thank you. Henry, please continue.
All right, I appreciate that. Thanks, Aubin. Aubin, our new split board president, representing well there. Thank you. So continuing with the other species that used to inhabit the plains in great abundance, the beaver, okay? Now, the beaver is making a major comeback today. Many of you have probably read the book Eager before. I just read it myself this past year by Ben Goldfarb. He's turning many of us into beaver believers, but beaver used to range between 100 to 400, I repeat, 400 million beaver in North America, just incredible amounts of beaver. That's down to probably around 10 to 15 million today. And then of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the really important ecosystem process of fire. So indigenous peoples, particularly on the Great Plains, have been managing these ecosystems for millennia prior to westward colonization. They were incredibly good managers of these systems. They maintained grasslands. They helped expand the herd of bison to the height that it achieved. And that's an incredibly important part of grassland systems worldwide. These two different factors of fire and then, of course, the grazing, which you get from the prairie dogs and the bison. So how has this ecosystem changed since 1800? I've been alluding to this, but as we all know, the Great Plains has experienced enormous change over the last couple hundred years. In particular, when through various sort of iterations of the Homestead Act and expansion into these areas by white settlers, European settlers, there was an enormous amount of Great Plains that was plowed up between around probably 1870 to 1930. In fact, tens of millions of acres were plowed up and more than 1 billion acres of topsoil was lost from the Great Plains. So just an incredible sort of dismantling of an ecosystem. It was called the Great Plow Up, and it culminated, as many are probably aware, in the Dust Bowl, which was the decade of the 1930s, which was you had tens of millions of acres of bare ground exposed. The dust blew so greatly that on Black Sunday, April 14, 1935, it blew all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe and made people sick there. So, you know, probably the most calamitous environmental disaster, certainly in modern North American history, if not world history. And so, you know, with this destruction of the habitat came also the sort of wholesale destruction of wildlife. This is a famous picture that you probably all have seen. You know, just sort of a snapshot of the amount of wildlife that was killed during these sort of these routes of our fauna throughout the 1800s. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the Dust Bowl. This is actually a picture from one of the big dust storms in the 1930s. And so, where are we at now? And you know, what is happening in this ecosystem? That's going to be the focus for the rest of this talk. But in particular, I want to define a keystone species for those who aren't familiar. So there's a couple different definitions you could give to a keystone species. I'll name a couple here that resonate with me. One of them is a species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend, such that if they were removed from the ecosystem would change drastically. So think species that are very highly connective, species that have a disproportionate influence on the ecosystem, and species around them, which is how this second definition is, disproportionately large impact relative to its population size. So what are some examples of keystone species? Well, some examples are things like apex predators, things like wolves. For those of us who live in Colorado, there has been a battle going on in the past couple of years surrounding wolves, which many of the ranching and producer community does not like, even though we have so altered these ecosystems that, you know, basically there are no more apex predators predators in the plains anymore. And so these wolves have been introduced into mountains. One can only hope that one day they'll make it out to the plains. But wolves have such a huge impact on their ecosystem, as do many apex predators, large grazers and ungulates. So bison is the great example from North America, but these animals exist worldwide in grasslands. And as I mentioned, grazing is a very important process that helps to maintain grassland habitat, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then finally, species that are ecosystem engineers. And of course, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. For example, a bison is both a large grazer and an ecosystem engineer. But of course, the one that we always like to think about, and one of our personal favorites, is the prairie dog. The prairie dogs have so many impacts on their ecosystem, and I won't spoil it because we're going to get into that here in a minute. But let's talk about what has happened to these three keystone species of the Great Plains: the bison, the beaver, and the prairie dog. Now, when you talk about bison, I really like this figure because it illustrates the contraction of the range over the decades, starting in about 1800 or the late 1700s. And you can see bison actually went as far east as New York and as far south as Florida. They ranged just an enormous range across the Great Plains. And again, a lot of that was generated by this sort of intentional management of these ecosystems to generate more grasslands, which then supported more bison. So you can see here, by about 1880 or 1890, there were these tiny little herds left. There were fewer than probably about 1,000 bison across the entire range, it's thought. So just an enormous population bottleneck. And that has sort of, defined the struggle for bison since then. Even now, we're only at a tiny fraction of that original 30 to 60 million that they used to be on the plains. Now, there are many benefits that bison bring to the table. We're going to talk about this here a little bit later, but these can be both ecological benefits, such as that grazing that I mentioned, nutrient cycling, but also cultural benefits. It's important to mention that, bisons provided a lot of food security for indigenous, particularly plains tribes, and many other aspects of those cultures as well. And so the loss of this species has had not only ecological impacts, but also enormous cultural impacts, as many of us probably know. So have to give a shout out here to one of our audience members, which is Elise Ellswood, who is the founder of Grasslands, Colorado. Elise is a brilliant designer, and she made these keystone species posters, which illustrate in a really nice summary kind of why these species are important in their own ways. So if you look at bison here, and by the way, if you're interested in learning more, I'm happy to make these slides available. You can see a QR code right there in the bottom right if you'd like to learn more about Grasslands, Colorado. So, just looking at some of the things that bison do, I could talk for an hour about this, okay? But I'm gonna keep it very brief here. They promote plant diversity. The grazing that I mentioned helps maintain a balanced ecosystem and create a diversity of plants through the heterogeneity that they induce through their grazing. They're very important for the soil. They help aerate the soil, improve water absorption, nutrient cycling. They're big seed dispersers. If anyone has ever seen, you might be able to see a little bit in this bison here, but bison are often carrying hundreds of seeds in the fur on the outside of their body, in addition to the seeds that they disperse through eating. And then, of course, the impacts of climate change, right? Bison help enhance the carbon cycle and promote carbon storage. They have less of an impact on native grasses and riparian systems than cattle, which dominate the Great Plains today. So many benefits that bison bring to the table. But again, just a really great illustration of why they are such an important keystone species in the Great Plains. Now let's move on to prairie dogs. And prairie dogs are another very sad story of a species that used to just have an enormous range and now occupies probably less than 1% of their original distribution, and probably about the same in terms of the total numbers of prairie dogs that are out there on the Great Plains. Now, one of the biggest reasons for these prairie dog declines is hunting. And so there's actually a really, really brilliant case study that has just been released, and there's an effort to try to get CPW to protect prairie dogs on public lands in Colorado. Prairie dogs are often indiscriminately hunted, including on public lands, not to mention private lands. This is just one example, but these outfits can kill hundreds, if not thousands, of prairie dog in a given period of time. The other thing that has affected prairie dogs throughout their life since 1900, when it was introduced into the United States, is plague. So this is the same kind of plague that affected populations in medieval Europe. This is called the sylvatic plague, but it's Yersinia pestis is the pathogen, and it was brought over probably on rats and introduced to the U.S. Through the port of San Francisco in around 1900, and then it spread throughout the American West. And prairie dogs were evolutionarily naive to plague; they'd never experienced this, and even to this day, today, when a prairie dog colony undergoes what's called an epizootic event of plague, which is a major outbreak, it can decimate a colony, kill up to 90 or 9, even 95% of the individuals in that colony who lack resistance to that plague. So between the plague and the persecution by most of the landowners of the American West, we've just had these dramatic contractions. However, I will, there is some positive to take away from this. So this is from a project that was recently done by some folks at the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, where they did this enormous mapping exercise throughout the entire continental United States and the Great Plains region to see where the best areas for prairie dogs were in terms of habitat suitability. And what you see here is that that denser and darker color indicates a higher habitat suitability. Southeast Colorado is actually one of the best areas for prairie dogs in the entire Great Plains. So a little bit of a silver lining and put some context into the work that we are currently doing at the Southern Plains Land Trust to bring our prairie dogs back and expand those colonies. Now, here's another brilliant keystone species highlight from Elise in Grasslands, Colorado. And what do prairie dogs do? Well, they create these enormous burrow systems, and those burrows are super important. They provide habitat for a lot of species, including some of the rarest species in the state of Colorado for wildlife. The species are so rare because they depend on prairie dogs, which have contracted and declined so much in recent decades. So these are species like the burrowing owl, which is always a fan favorite, the most endangered terrestrial mammal in North America, the black-footed ferret, ferruginous hawks, and the list goes on. They also improve soil health. They aerate the soil similar to bison. Their activity of burrowing can increase water absorption and nutrient distribution. They actually select for diversity of species, and they actually end up creating a landscape with a lot more forbs, which ends up providing a lot of resources for pollinators, which have also, as many of us know, been declining in recent decades. There are more than 150 species that we know of that have been found associating with prairie dogs and depending on them to some degree for survival. So, really just another outsized sort of impact on the ecosystem, which is why they're a keystone species. And of course, I love this diagram that my friend Anna Davidson made, but you can see here, how everything is connected in these food webs and how prairie dogs are the nexus in this network of ecological connections, right? So, they're an important food source for species like coyotes or swift foxes or the black-footed ferret. Their burrow building increases bare soil, but it also increases soil nutrients and forb cover, which increases pollinator abundance. There are many animals that really like that close crop grass that prairie dogs select for, which allows them to see predators on the landscape, such as the mountain plover, which is one of the rarest and most declining birds in the shortgrass prairie. The list goes on. So just a really great example of how they're kind of the nexus for all these interactions. Lastly, there's the beaver. And so this is a diagram of the Santa Fe Trail, which was the main thoroughfare leading from St. Louis out into the west. And on the Santa Fe Trail in Colorado, the most important location was Bent's Old Fort. Bent's Old Fort was founded in 1833. And actually, when Bent's Old Fort was founded, it was originally founded sort of at the tail end of the beaver trade in Colorado. So it started in the early 1800s, probably around 1807 to 1808. And between then and 1840, all of the beaver of the Southern Plains and northern New Mexico, southeast Colorado, the entire area were completely extirpated. They were wiped out. Beaver were really easy to trap, and the trappers kind of turned it into a science, and they just completely wiped out this species. And the effects of this are still being seen today. So this graph here on the left is a graph of the state of Colorado. This is from a great paper from 2022, and what you see here is areas where what is sort of the existing beaver dam capacity throughout the state. And what you can see, particularly in the southeast part of the state, is there's a pretty low capacity to support beaver. Why is this? The reason why is because with the absence of beaver and all the other impacts that the 100+ year presence of cattle on the landscape have done, etc., these riparian and hydrological systems are so damaged that they can't really support beaver the way that they used to. And this is something that we're actively working on that I'll talk about here in a minute. But just to highlight what beavers do for the riparian ecosystem, in the Great Plains, in shortgrass prairie, 80% of species depend on the riparian habitat to some degree for survival. These are very dry systems, and it only makes up about 2% of the overall habitat or land cover. So just the riparian is super important for climate change, for everything. Beaver slow the flow, they raise the water table, they put more water on the landscape, and across the board, I would argue maybe even more than bison and prairie dogs, they generate biodiversity. They bring in the biodiversity, plants, animals, you name it, they bring it all in. Water storage, okay? The ability to store water and to hydrate the landscape, rehydrate the landscape is so critical in these heavily damaged and incised stream systems. They alleviate drought impacts. They also alleviate wildfires, right? Having this wet habitat can serve as a fire break that can prevent wildfires from spreading. There's so many other examples, but just a few here that show why beaver are so important. And then the last thing that I'd like to talk about in terms of these keystone processes is not a species, but the process of burning and of fire. As I mentioned, indigenous tribes have had burned for millennia before westward expansion started. But after that, since probably around the mid 1800s, there's been wide scale fire suppression across the American West. We've seen the consequences in recent years in the news when you have these mega fires happening in forests. But what the other impact of fire suppression is that it has been slowly eating away at the grasslands, and this is called woody encroachment. Much of this is eastern red cedar in the eastern plains where we're at. It's one seed juniper. But if you look at the amount of woody encroachment on the Great Plains in the last 30 or so years, you see particularly in the eastern plains, there's been this sort of paradigm shift or state shift from a grassland to a more savanized or savanna-like ecosystem. And if we don't do something about this, it's consuming millions of acres. Not per year, but over the last 30 years, it's consumed millions of acres of grassland that could be really good, productive, healthy grassland that is now more like a savanna habitat. So, okay. That's a lot of information. It's also a little bit depressing, but that's where we come in at the Southern Plains Land Trust. So I'm happy to talk about how we're working in this space and with the keystones. And before I do, I'd like to just give a little bit of a background for those who aren't super familiar, although many of us probably do know this already. But we are a land trust that mostly buys land. So that's pretty rare for land trusts. We also have some easements, as you can see here in this graph. But by buying land, it allows us to manage for biodiversity. And so we are able to essentially bring in these keystone species, restore these species, and try to give them a refuge from all of the human pressures out in this ecosystem. So currently we protect about 60,000 acres. We've seen rapid growth in acres protected. This is just a little bit of a map for those who would like to see the preserves that we own in fee. So these are the 4 preserves that we own in fee. The most recent one is the Purgatoire River, which is up by Los Animas, Heartland, which is our largest, Raven's Nest, and then also Fresh Tracks down in Baca County. We have a bison herd, which is 150 animals strong and is healthy and growing. We have prairie dogs and ferrets, and we also have, of course, beavers. So that kind of rounds out the keystones. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in terms of bison moving forward and sort of our plan for these keystones moving forward. So, the biggest thing with bison is we are working now on ways to understand, how our herd is impacting the shortgrass prairie ecologically. This is a largely open question. Most of the research that is out there on bison and their impacts as keystone species comes from tallgrass or mixed grass prairie. So there's a major role for us to study these impacts through a variety of ways, which I'm happy to chat about in the question session, to understand how these species are behaving, their social structure, how they're impacting the landscape, and how they are generating biodiversity in the shortgrass prairie. Another big part of our bison herd is we are trying to remove all of the internal fences from our preserves, particularly Heartland, which is where our bison herd is located. Removing those internal fences allows the animals to move naturally around the landscape. The American West, as many of us know, has been majorly parceled up, and barbed wire can be extremely dangerous for wildlife when it isn't maintained, particularly for species like pronghorn, which like to try to go under the fence and often get caught and get snagged and die in the fence. So at Split, we work on trying to remove all internal fence, and all of our perimeter fence is made wildlife friendly, which has a smooth top and bottom wire, and the bottom wire is 18 inches off the ground, which allows pronghorn to go under and deer to go over unscathed. Finally, I'd like to mention that, we are exploring opportunities to try to get more involved with bison tribes. So there's a lot of tribal bison restoration that has been happening on the northern plains in particular. The situation is quite different on the southern plains. And so I think there's a role for us at Split to start working with tribes to help acquire more land that could be for more bison herds and potentially involve tribal engagement and collaboration. So it's sort of early days now, but something that could be potentially exciting moving forward in the future, and working with some of these tribes that are trying to restore bison in their own ancestral lands. Now let's move on to prairie dogs. I love showing this graph because it makes me proud, and I can't claim credit for this. This happened before I joined Split, which was in 2023. But you can see here how our prairie dog acres have grown over the last 7 or 8 years. In particular, since we've started treating for plague and mitigating on an annual basis. And in fact, Split has one of the most robust plague mitigation programs in the country. Of all of the 15 black-footed ferret recovery sites out there, we are doing really well, and you can see the results here. So you can see that as of last year, we were at about 3,200 acres. We still have not tallied up the total for this year, so TBD. But as these acres grow, it provides more habitat for those species that I mentioned, like black-footed ferrets and burrowing owls, and we're just so excited to see this happen. And this is a nice sort of graph which shows kind of the distribution of prairie dogs across Heartland. So you can see, they're starting to occupy most of the ranch, and some of these colonies have actually grown together into mega colonies as the years have gone on. So just tremendous growth, and we're super excited to continue this into the future. The last thing I'll mention is we are trying to push the boundaries by using conservation technology to understand why ferrets are not surviving at reintroduction sites. So the ferret program has been going for almost 30 years. It's an amazing program. The captive breeding, they've got it down to a science. But the problem is on the side where they're doing reintroduction, because essentially what they do is they'll release animals, and then usually we'll come back about a year later to look for them, and you don't know what's going on in between, which is a big problem if you're trying to conserve the black-footed ferrets. You need to know what is limiting their population being established. And so we're working with, in a really cool collaboration with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which runs the ferret reintroduction program, Smithsonian Institution, and also CPW, or Colorado Parks and Wildlife, to track species, including the ferret, on Heartland, and understand what the mortality sources are, what their movements are, what their home ranges are, how they're surviving, all of these questions, which have up to this point been pretty much unattainable, because this is a new technology that has just been developed over the past year or two. So I'm happy to answer questions about that, but very excited to be at the sort of cutting edge of conservation technology there. Now, in terms of beaver, I want to mention that beaver were never detected on Heartland until the spring of 2024. And that was the first spring after which cattle had been fully and permanently removed from Heartland. So it's been incredible to see the passive recovery, right? We're doing a lot of active restoration, but there's also a lot of passive recovery happening in this landscape that has been so heavily and year-round grazed by cattle for over 100 years. So exciting to have beaver come back. But the thing about beaver is that beaver are so variable, and there is almost nothing known about what beaver are doing on the plains. When we think about beaver, and the same is true for me of this, I have the same bias, but you tend to think of these giant beaver dams and these big, wooded structures and beavers gnawing trees and all the typical beaver activity. But beaver are living a different existence on the plains. And we don't know much about it, but what we do know is that it seems to be different. They seem to be more nondescript. You can kind of tell where they are sometimes by their scent mounds and by their slides into the water. And you can see their dams when you're out there in the field. But, the ability to sort of use AI and other technologies to detect beaver like they've done in montane systems is just not the same in the plains. And so, and part of this is because so much of this land is privately owned, and there have been beaver been extirpated from this land for so long. So, it's a really interesting time, because Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the state wildlife management agency in Colorado, is actually developing a beaver management plan. So there's a chance here for us to be at the forefront of understanding what beaver are doing on the plains, how they're behaving, how they are or maybe are not as big of ecosystem engineers as in montane systems, and things like that. So that's also a really exciting opportunity. And I really quickly want to mention that we've been making a lot of inroads into collaborating with our neighbors. And this was something that was started by our former executive director, Nicole Rosemarino, and I'm trying to carry that torch and build forward with that. But currently for our black-footed ferret telemetry work, where we're going to be tracking animals, we've actually gotten permission to survey on all of these different preserves, which constitutes more than 100,000 acres in our area. So just really, really great work with landowner relations, and trying to collaborate with across the fence to suss out some of these cool conservation questions. And that so hoping to do some of the same stuff with beaver as well. And really quickly, I couldn't help myself, but I had to play a little video for you of one of our beaver dams on Heartland. And I'll show you a diagram here which can contextualize this, but you can see, it's a very incised stream drainage here. However, there's a lot of standing water on the landscape, and just the color alone, you can tell the greenery and the amount of vegetation is just, so different from the surrounding area. So a lot of these effects are currently constrained to the stream bed and the drainage, but ultimately, over the years, as beaver continue to occupy these areas and bring the water table up, we really hope to see, the water, the stream reconnecting with the floodplain, starting to get more of a dynamic and sort of floodplain-like system out there. So just really quickly, when you look at the diagram of beaver recovery, where it starts is kind of over here, and this is kind of the basal state for a lot of the streams out on Heartland, and just in the shortgrass prairie in general. There no vegetation, they're extremely incised, there's a lot of soil being lost constantly, actively eroding, very deep channels, etc. And so we're kind of, I think, here on the left side of this diagram, although we're starting to see, some of those effects of beaver already. So really, really exciting to be there at the beginning of when beaver started to come back on Heartland, so we can monitor these effects over time. Lastly, I'll quickly talk about prescribed fire and pyrrhic herbivory. This is a work in progress. And as you might imagine, when you work with people who are grass farmers, like cattle ranchers, and their prime currency is grass, they don't like it when their grass is burned, when they need there to be grass on the ground. And so it's not necessarily an easy issue, but it's something that we absolutely have to implement, because fire is such an important part of these ecosystems. So figuring out the best practices for controlled burns and prescribed fire in these systems, as well as the interaction between grazing and fire, or the fancy word pyrrhic herbivory, are also things that we're going to be looking into very heavily moving forwards and researching. So to sum up, hopefully I've convinced you that bison are really important, and moving forward, we're going to try to quantify how they're impacting shortgrass prairie, and we're also going to try to advance strategic partnerships for bison conservation. For prairie dogs, we're going to continue our tremendous plague mitigation program, and we're going to leverage new conservation technologies to try to advance the survival and establishment of black-footed ferrets. For beaver, we're going to work on a regional basis to try to determine their distribution and abundance, and also quantify those keystone species impacts on the riparian systems and biodiversity. And finally, for fire, we're hoping in the next year or two to initiate prescribed burns and also determine best management practices in the shortgrass prairie. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. I have to mention, my co-director Judith said you need to tell people who might not be aware. So we have our annual gala on November 15th, which is in a couple weeks. But for those who have not bought tickets, please come join us and come learn more about what we're doing at Split, and particularly about some of the work we're doing to try to conserve the critically endangered lesser prairie chicken. So thank you so much for listening. I'll leave it at that, and happy to take questions. Thanks.
Hey, Henry,
Yes.
can you put that QR code? You have a box, I put in the comments, you have this box that was covering the QR code. If you want to put it back up, I bet Judith would be super happy.
Okay. Can you see it now?
No.
It might take a second.
There it is.
There we go. I'll just leave that up. Sorry about that. Good call, Lise. Okay, happy to take any questions. Nobody? Sage grouse. We got a question. Okay, that's great. Thank you, Kate. I appreciate that. We do not have sage grouse. Sage grouse are distributed farther to the north. They are in Colorado. There's actually a couple different species, but they're not present in the southern part of the state. Thanks. All righty. Well, I'm gonna sit awkwardly for a little bit because oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, this is Barb Sterling, and I was wondering, do you know how many bison your ranch can support? Do you have a figure on that?
That's a great question. We actually just got some numbers on that, so I don't want to I don't want to act like these are written in stone, but the ballpark numbers are on the lower end about 300 or probably about 250 animals, and then on the higher end to probably about 500. But our plan will be to try to keep them at the lower end if possible, manage them at the lower end because if they're at the higher end and there's a really bad drought year or something, you risk a lot of animal mortality, which is not ideal. So yeah, that's a great question. Okay, more questions. I'm just going to go through the chat. What's the new technology using for black-footed ferrets? Great question, Sue. So I'm probably not the best person to talk about this because I did not develop this or pilot test it, but a guy named Jesse Bolaris who works at Smithsonian has developed these collars over the past 2 years. So they're collars that go around the neck of the animal. They're super safe. They've been tested for about 2 years in controlled field settings to make sure that they don't fall off and they don't injure the animal. So this has been something that's been in the works for a long time. And we were lucky enough because we have such an amazing prairie dog growth and are becoming such an important site for black-footed ferrets. We were approached by Smithsonian to see if we wanted to try to implement this to figure out what's actually happening to our ferrets after we let them out there in the field. And so, yeah, really excited to figure that out. And we'll definitely keep people posted on that. Good question. All right. How do you plan on implementing prescribed burns? That's a good question. The short answer is don't really know yet, but I think that that there's going to be a lot of knowledge that has to go into that to try to understand what scale we're going to be implementing these burns, where are the target areas that we want to be focusing the burns on. We have some ideas about that. I think in general there are some particularly areas that have been most recently grazed by cattle that are quite disturbed, and so have a lot of kochia and a lot of other non-native species that sort of dominate those areas. So I think those would be probably good places to start. But the short answer is it's a work in progress. Thanks. Okay, Karen's asking, how many black-footed ferrets do you have? So that's an interesting question, Karen. The short answer is we don't really know. And the reason we don't know is because none of these animals have been able to be tracked in real time. Every ferret that is released into the wild has what's called a PIT tag, which PIT stands for passive integrated transponder. It's like a tiny little kind of like microchip like your dog or cat would have. The problem with that is that it's super short range. So in order to figure out which particular animal that is, because each one has their own individual sort of serial number associated with that tag, you actually have to have the animal run through a PIT tag reader, which is like a small circular piece of equipment. So it's not easy. It's not easy to accurately estimate the population numbers or understand what is potentially killing the ferrets, which is the whole reason why we're trying to implement this collar technology. Yeah. Okay, Angela. My ranch neighbor kills prairie dog because they eat the grass. How can we convince him otherwise? Wow, that is a can of worms right there. I could probably just kick it over to my friend Elise here because she's thought a lot about this. But the reality is there are some really good organizations out there who are working to try to prevent prairie dogs from being killed. This has been, at the center of SPLT's whole mission and the reason for us being. In fact, when we were originally founded in 1998, it was to try to save prairie dogs that were being killed, exterminated in the Front Range. And so, the short answer is I would say send me an email and I would be happy, Angela. Let me put my email in the chat here. But I would be happy to give you a little bit more detailed information about whom you could contact and some potential solutions to deal with that issue. Yeah, we don't want any prairie dogs killed if we can help it. So happy to help. There's my email. Okay. What are your plans once you reach carrying capacity of bison? What are you planning on doing with the surplus? Questions are from Steve. That is a great question. And another one that I think I could probably chat for a while about. The short answer to that is we are actively trying to figure out ways to manage this herd. There are a limited number of options for managing a wild bison herd. I think some of the options that we've considered are things like trying to find ways to slow reproduction, whether through birth control or other means. We've also talked about trying to get some infrastructure built on Heartland, which is something that I definitely think we're trying to move towards, which would give us the flexibility to be able to transfer bison to other locations that are trying to build bison herds. Those are kind of the main things that we're thinking about right now. But, it definitely is a conundrum because when you have a wild animal herd that doesn't have any native predators, there has to be some sort of a check on that population, or otherwise they'll grow unchecked until either they have an enormous population crash and a lot of animals die. There's a great example of that from a place in the Netherlands, which was sort of rewilding experiment that I'd encourage you to look up. But yes, the short answer is we're working on that, Sue and Steve, and I'm happy to give you updates as things develop. All right. For burning, Niober, oh, that's a great recommendation. I'm going to write that down, Kate. Thank you so much. And yes, we are working with folks in Colorado too. There's actually a pretty robust prescribed fire community in Colorado that we've started to tap into and are trying to build connections with. Reiner, I see you've got a hand up there.
Hi, Henry. Bison related. Colorado just declared bison to be wildlife, so they can no longer be killed once they wander in from Utah. So the big question is right now, what will be a management look like CPW puts together? And
yeah, I think that both for bison and beaver, I think that's going to take some time. And I think that, and I would encourage folks in the audience here, those who are interested in seeing more keystone species on the landscape and in advocating for, the expansion of those species, to contribute your thoughts to these processes. It's extremely important that we weigh in, and there are a lot of voices always on the other side. Well, I don't want to say the other side, but there's a lot of voices, who are for indiscriminate animal killing, and I think that that's something that we all want to avoid and are pretty passionate about. At least a lot of the folks who are the diehard split fans. So I would say, the short answer is I think it's going to take time, but I think it's really important that we all weigh in and give our thoughts. And Southern Plains Land Trust will certainly be weighing in. There are a fair number of bison herds in Colorado, but there's you could count them on two hands. And so I think that ultimately, trying to weigh in with all the stakeholders and figuring out kind of what management practices have been in the herds that are existing, and what the carrying capacity is, like we're doing currently in our preserves on certain different areas, is going to be really important. So it'll take time, but please do keep tabs on that and weigh in. And thank you, Reiner, for that thought. All right. What does your plague mitigation process consist of? That's a really good question. And many colonies in the Front Range are being eliminated because of plague fears. So, this is one of the, I would say, probably the greatest pieces of misinformation about. Now, it's not to say there certainly have been a couple recorded instances of people getting plague. It can happen. It's not like if they get plague, it's going to turn into an Ebola thing that they then transmit to a bunch of other people. Plague is relatively low risk for humans, particularly if you're not out there handling prairie dogs or in close proximity to them. So ultimately, the risk of plague is extremely low from prairie dog to human transmission, and it's a big problem. Like we need to combat that misinformation. But as you mentioned, that type of misinformation is the reason why prairie dog colonies are often indiscriminately killed, as to many other pieces of misinformation about prairie dogs. What we do in terms of our mitigation is sort of threefold, and so we're using sort of all the available tools that are out there that in the plague mitigation sphere. And so that includes Delta dust. Delta dust is an insecticide that's usually in a dust form that is sort of dumped into the prairie dog holes. There's fipronil, which is another insecticide, the same kind of insecticide that's in your pet's frontline, which is extremely effective against fleas. And so fipronil is another tool that we use. And then the last one that we use is actually a vaccine. So that's administered through food. And when the bait is taken up by the animals, it confers immunity. Now, the vaccine in and of itself is not very effective because prairie dogs are an R-selected species. So they have short lifespans. They breed pretty quickly and they die. And so basically, you're going to have a lot of turnover in a population any given year. So you have to, even if you're doing vaccine every year, that's probably only going to give you about 30% protection from a plague episodic event. The two main tools are the insecticides, both of which are controversial and both of which probably have downstream non-target effects on arthropods, small rodents, other species. These are things that people are actively trying to understand, to figure out, is it worth it to, dump all of this stuff out there? And I don't think that's a simple answer. But I do think that prairie dogs are so important ecologically that I can see the, you know, and that's been our rationale. You know, we never want to harm any animals, but I think that, you know, when you are getting the ecological bang for your buck that prairie dogs are bringing, you know, I think it's worth it. So, you know, we could talk more about that, but really, really good question. Right. Okay, Elise had a, oh, okay. Is that true? I thought there was a more recent outbreak in Colorado. Elise, could you comment on that?
Sure. It's about death. So plague is highly treatable now. Simple penicillin will treat it. It's not really a cause of concern for humans. There was one death attributed to prairie dogs, and that was a man who was skinning it, and it was already infected, and he was skinning it. So, and he didn't go to the doctor. So there's been six in the last 70 years that have been correlated to prairie dogs of people getting plague, and 5 of them took simple antibiotics, and you know, we're just fine. So.
Alrighty, thanks, Elise. That's good context there. Okay, keep moving. I'm looking through these questions here. How do reptiles and amphibians affect the prairie and act as keystones? That's a good question. You know, reptiles are not typically thought of as keystone species. Again, the definition of keystone being a species that has disproportionate impacts relative to their abundance on the landscape. I'd have to think about a good keystone. I mean, there are keystone reptile predators. I just don't know if there would necessarily be a keystone in our ecosystem. You know, there's like prairie rattlesnakes, and I'm trying to think. But I'll have to think more about that. Thanks for that food for thought there. Yeah. Cool. Okay, anything else? We're running up on time here. I'm happy to take 1 or 2 more. But yeah, any other final questions before we hit the road here? Okay. Well, it was a pleasure to have you all here. Thanks for coming, and thanks for listening, and thanks for caring about keystones, most importantly. So feel free to reach out to me. If you don't know me, I think most people in here do know me, but if you don't, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to chat more about any of this stuff, and really appreciate you guys all coming. So take care. Have a good night.
Thanks, Henry.
Bye, everybody.